My name is Bruce Maddy-Weitzman, and I'll be chairing this session on North African politics and parties. Just a couple of introductory remarks. It's now been 12 years since Mohamed Bouazizi set himself alight and sparked an unprecedented tsunami of popular protest across the MENA region, toppling regimes, challenging ruling elites, and altering the balance of power between the overstated states, to use Nazih Ayoubi's term, and newly mobilized and energized societies. The euphoria has long since dissipated, as few or none of the various outcomes of these protests can be deemed to be successes. Even the Tunisian exception to the rule, the successful transition to a democratic regime, is now in jeopardy. And that's maybe even an understatement. One of the shortcomings in the voluminous literature analyzing what actually happened during these last 12 years is the absence of fine-grained analysis of on-the-ground dynamics. How are people actually governed or misgoverned? What are the mechanisms that authoritarian regimes use to maintain power? What are some of the factors that inhibit genuine empowerment by non-elite sectors? How do ordinary people perceive their situation, and how do they cope? All four papers in today's panel addresses these questions from one angle or another. Their rigorous analyses combine theoretical sophistication with on-the-ground empirical research that gives voice to the voiceless and offers us much food for thought. And with that, let us begin. The first, and I'll introduce each presenter in turn. The first paper is by Dr. Lindsay Benstead, of Portland State, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Middle East Studies Center at Portland State University, a past Kuwait visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Research has been published in numerous journals, PhD from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and her paper today is Dominant Party Affiliation and Perceived Institutional Performance, Evidence from Local Governance in Algeria. Professor Benstead. I will pull over to here.
All right, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and many thanks to the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa for the support of this paper and for putting on this conference. The paper that I'll present today is co-authored with Zine Barka, who's an Algerian scholar in public affairs, and it's entitled Dominant Party Affiliation and Perceived Institutional Performance, Evidence from Local Governance in Algeria. The research questions that we're addressing in this paper are the following. Why do authoritarian regimes maintain power? Are local councillors from dominant parties able to serve citizens more effectively than those from opposition parties, therefore contributing to the power of dominant parties vis-a-vis opposition parties? We know little about the work of local government and how citizens perceive its performance. Local government's role in authoritarian contexts is largely limited to the distribution of clientelistic services and a few areas of service provision, including garbage collection, water, roads, things like that. However, in Algeria, as in many other contexts in the developing world, engagement with the mayor and elected local council representatives is also one of the key avenues through which citizens experience the state on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, it follows that citizens' experience with local governments likely shapes their satisfaction with their representatives, councils, and the regime writ large. Some research that exists on this topic suggests that local government could be a way for dominant parties to solidify their power. In contrast, research from South Africa and Tunisia suggests that local government can be a site for opposition parties to essentially do a good job in local communities and challenge the dominant parties. But we need to know more about why dominant parties hold on to power and the role that perceived performance plays. We argue in this paper that local officials' ability to respond effectively to citizens' demands is a function of local councillors' relationship with the state in the form of dominant party affiliation or opposition party affiliation. Essentially, we're making an institutional argument about the role that informal institutions and formal institutions play. Informal institutions, we think there are informal institutions such as clientelism that are part of this story, and formal institutions which include intergovernmental structure, including reserved domains in the form of the governor position, which is an appointed position. Algeria is an authoritarian regime with semi-competitive elections. Since 1989, Algeria has held multi-party legislative and presidential elections, with the exception of the 1990s during the war. Parties in Algeria, there are numerous parties in Algeria. However, the dominant parties today are the FLN and the RND. The FLN, of course, the successor of the Movement for Independence in Algeria, and for many years the single party, and the RND, the National Rally for Democracy, being a new party that was created in the 1990s in order to restart elections after they were canceled in 1990. So we can think of these two dominant parties, the FLN and the RND. So local councillors may run as members of the dominant parties. They may run as members of some of the Islamist parties, which include the Movement for Society and Peace, and other non-Islamist parties such as the Workers' Party. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about intergovernmental structure in Algeria. On the one side of this, we have national, regional, and local levels of government. So we have, in the legislative branch, we have the bicameral parliament, we have the APWs, the assemblies of the wilayat or the provinces, and then we have the APCs, which are the local councils. So we have these three levels of government with intergovernmental relations between these three. Okay. But we also have a distinction between those bodies that are directly elected in elections, including the FAN, the National Parliament, at least for its Chamber of Representatives, the APWs at the regional level, and the APCs. So these are the directly elected bodies. But we also have the appointed bodies, which include what I call the reserved positions. The governor or the wali of the 48, until 2015, the 48 wilayat in the country is an appointed position. And just as there are communes that make up the 48 administrative districts, there are also daira, which are the regimes or the state's local administrative presence in the locality. Okay, so we have, until 2015, Algeria had 48 wilayat, and below that, 1,541 communes. But it also, through the institution of the appointed governor or wali, also is divided into daira, which are the administration's representation in the locality. Okay, so we have this sort of this duality, which involves not only different levels of elected government, but also this appointed as well as directly elected level. Okay, so in terms of the theoretical framework, we look at Andreas Schedler's menu of manipulation. And Schedler's model, the menu of manipulation, was one in which he looked at the 7 institutions of polyarchy, Dahl's polyarchy, and he theorized about the ways in which authoritarian regimes violate these democratic norms in these 7 different institutions, such that the regime cannot be considered democratic. And 3 of those norm violations include reserved positions, reserved domains, and tutelage. And these are 3 of the norm violations that really come to bear directly on local government. So for example, one of the reserved positions in Algeria, as I mentioned, is the wali, the governor of the wilaya. The 48 wilayat have governors, and by appointing this wali, the regime and the dominant party have their representative at the head of the province. Okay. All right. So we theorize about the ways in which local councillors or regional councillors, when they're elected, if they're from dominant parties, they have a stronger, closer tie with the wali than if they're from opposition parties. So the opposition parties don't have the opportunity to elect a governor. It's only the dominant parties that can share this perspectives. So we think that the pathway to greater effectiveness or greater perceived effectiveness on the part of local councillors from dominant parties is through this clientelistic network, such that local councillors representing the dominant parties have someone from their someone that is more likely to be in their clientelistic network in the form of the wali, whereas those from opposition parties don't have this network. We have 2 hypotheses. The first, all else being equal, mayors and local council members from dominant parties, that is FLN or RND, will be more likely to successfully help citizens than independents and those from non-dominant parties. So we think that those from the FLN, councillors from the FLN or the RND, will be perceived as more effective in helping citizens. And we also hypothesize that citizens in localities with a historically privileged relationship with the central government, including the BTS triangle, will be more likely to receive a positive response to their requests for help. We used qualitative interviews, and we also used a nationally representative survey of 782 Algerian citizens that I conducted in 2008. In order to measure our independent variable, we first asked citizens, have you or anyone else living here tried to contact a member of your local council? If so, the most recent time, what party did he or she represent? We found that 1/4 of citizens had contacted a member of a local council in the past 5 years. About half did not remember what party that individual was from or wouldn't say. But among the others, 20% represented the FLN and 10% the RND. MSP, that's an Islamist party, the PT were also among those local councillors that citizens had said that they had contacted. So the independent variable is what was the party of the local councillor contacted. The 2 dependent variables were satisfaction with the outcome of this request and expected helpfulness of local councillors. Citizens were more likely to be satisfied than dissatisfied if they had talked to a local councillor, and citizens in this country as a whole thought that the councils would be probably somewhat helpful. That was the most common response. All right, so our findings, our bivariate findings. First, we basically find that local councillors from the dominant parties are more effective at responding to local development needs than councillors from other parties, resulting in higher citizen satisfaction and expectation of helpfulness. So we are seeing that citizens who contact local councillors are more satisfied when they've contacted a member of the dominant party than a member of another party, and we believe this is because dominant parties have advantages through their clientelistic networks in order to be more effective in serving citizens through the provision of clientelistic services. So here we can see among citizens who had talked to a local councillor, mean satisfaction was highest when the councillor involved was from the RND, one of the dominant parties. And that was they were more satisfied than other parties or those that didn't remember which party they had talked to. For the second measure, mean expected helpfulness of local counselors, we can see that the highest expected helpfulness was among those who had contacted a member of the FLN, another dominant party. Those who were least likely to think that counselors would be helpful to them were those here that had never talked to any member of a local council in the 5 years before the survey. We also found some mixed evidence with regards to overall levels of satisfaction with local councils in those areas that have been historically advantaged by the regime, which include Batna, Sétif, and Algiers. We also used a regression model in order to check to see if these relationships were robust to multivariate analysis, and we found that they were. In conclusion, using a mixed methods design, we show that when the mayor or APC member enjoys a closer relationship with the wali as a result of being from a dominant party, they are more able to respond effectively to constituency service demands. Our research illustrates the importance of party politics in shaping citizens' perceptions of local governance performance in an understudied authoritarian case with implications for understanding parties' roles in authoritarian regime persistence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to the time limit. And since we're 4 presenters, everyone has to really try to be as prompt and precise on the time. Our next presenter is Dr. Hamdi Echkaou, who joined Akhawayn University in Ifran as an assistant professor of communications media in the fall of 2022. Congratulations. And in 2018, Dr. Echkaou, yes, earned his PhD in humanities from Mohammed Sank in Rabat, studied cyberspace discourses of the youth movement. This academic year, he is finalizing his dissertation in communications media and instructional technology doctoral program at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. 2 doctorates you're going to carry around. That's a lot. The title of his paper is Biographies of Insecurity, Labor Migration from the Moroccan Margins. Dr. Echkaou.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Dr. Bruce, and thank you very much for the organizers. Thank you very much for those who attended as well. So this paper is about biographies of insecurity, labor migration from the Moroccan margins. So this is a paper that both Johannes from Leipzig University and I worked on after a longitudinal study that started in 2009 with Leipzig University, actually with the Orientalisch Institute, that is a part of Leipzig University. Then we worked on that region, which is the High Atlas Mountains in Morocco. And here you see the map from Dr. James Miller. And so this is the region. So if we're talking about the country, this is the part of the country. This is the spot where the study is taking place, and this is the area of study. And talking about the map as well, this is like a specific focus on that area. So this is a very touristy area in Africa. This is the second highest peak in Africa after Kilimanjaro. So we're talking about Toubkal and Matat. That's the village where we focused our interviews on and the research. And this is more about this specific region. And again, you see there Matat. But just to bring this to the international focus. Actually, this region had an attention worldwide, especially from the media, after what happened, the terrorist attack that happened in this region in 2018. So this study that Johannes and I worked on explained how internal migration disturbs local social structures and violates traditional norms of social organization. Drawing on ethnographic fieldwork and in-depth interviews, this study investigates the reconfiguration of social relations in a small village, which is Matat here, which is located in the High Atlas Mountains under trans-regional and transnational migration, as what DHAS 2007 focuses on. The migratory movement cannot be adequately analyzed without considering the consequences of the agrarianization or depeasantization, which means that family farming is deteriorating. It also designates that agriculture is under threat or is becoming industrialized, in addition to the village, in this case Matat, is facing a struggle over land. So the confrontation between modernity and tradition turned family households of Matat into what Skilden defines as labor frontier that inflicts internal centralization of urban areas upon inhabitants of rural regions. In particular, the commodification of processes in agricultural production and the alteration of land labor into villagers' wage labor. So these villagers used to have a land that they could work on. Now, because of what happened in that region, now they moved into seeking wage labor in other areas that have taken a grip on this rural community. The village of Matat was selected as the case study of this research because of that longitudinal study started in 2009, 2012, 2015, and we observed that this village displayed fragmented outcomes of governmental actions such as investments in infrastructure, electricity, water, schools, and roads. So a clear example is the unpaved road that barely connects isolated mountainous areas to more developed urbanized towns like Asni and Imli. Based on the outcomes of the interviews feedback, Johannes and I support what Skilden 1997 reiterates, which is a part of Zelensky's idea that concept, actually, that is a vital mobility generating vital transition in economy, demography, and modernization. That is actually occurring in this village. So this vital mobility exemplified in a structural mismatch that occurs with these migrants' transitions resulted in continuous diversion from local ecological and subsistence agriculture while generating human sufferings among local migrants themselves and within their families at home. Thus, local migrants encounter incompatible trajectories between their expectations of their lived realities, marking a clear distinction in constituting what we frame as zones of identity, which is their village, and zones of aspiration, which is where they migrated to. Then the research question of this study focuses on that the aim of the study is to explore the change, which is here. So the research questions of this study is to explore the changed structures of insecurity, local migration, and family power structures within the village, and that the question then is what are the ramifications of internal migration on the region of Matat. So we marked the study area. So in late 1970s, Matat was known as a recruiting center for the mine of La Baritel. So there was a mine there, and which served as an important economic resource for the village. When the resources from the mine were exhausted, the people of Matat lost an important source of revenue. Evidence suggests that this shift in recruitment and employment also created a socioeconomic impact and features of recurring household shifts. As tourism became the primary form of employment in Matat, local farming and raising of sheep and goats have become a less viable source of revenue. With the demise of subsistence agriculture, migration has appeared as a recurrent phenomenon in Matat, especially in younger generation. Additionally, the limited nature of agriculture agricultural resources and the vulnerability related to supporting these resources have threatened the economic and societal ranks of adult males in the village. So to alleviate all of these pressures of marginalization and unfulfilled social responsibilities of the household, villagers began searching for resources outside of their hometown, outside of the village, which is Matat, which continued the deterioration of traditional and subsistent agriculture. The absence of regular, stable sources of revenue not only jeopardized livelihood, security, but also threatened the sense of the solid community, with the household being its core unit. Hence, relocating themselves as labor workers within the series of revenue earnings transformed local economic, familial, and financial crises by discharging the youth from being enclosed within their home circles and accessing urban territories. Now, the results of our interviews is that interviewees focused on that the value of the household is still important, because many participants mentioned that as children, they had reluctant inclination to leave the village. They did so to secure, means that they did leave their villages to secure a regular source of income for their family, which the parents hoped to maintain longer. Another common hope was that migrating would allow these migrants the possibility to send remittances back home to support their families, giving them both a higher personal status as indispensable members of the household, meaning giving these migrants a status within the household that they left. Second, the transition from land owners to wage employment. So the scarcity of resources that parental generations suffer from while managing their household was the main motive for migrants to migrate out of the village and symbolically out of poverty. The rare but consistent return home visits by earlier migrants to celebrate either the religious and social celebrations in the village enticed more potential migrants to leave for big cities seeking wage labor. For those staying in the village, the earlier migrants' visits directly or indirectly predicted the reality of safety and resolution beyond the hometown borders. Some of the participants contemplate migrating to Casablanca, Agadir, or Dakhla. Such migration was significantly attached to each participant's opportunities to make more money, the feasibility to support the family, and gaining a new personal and social position within what most of the migrants call takat, which is just the household. But takat here is significant from the terms of the migrants, because takat can mean that the fire that you lit in the household, and it also means that the burden being taken care by these migrants to make sure that the fire is lit in the household back at home. So for the majority of the migrants, Casablanca was the first destination and a common symbol to gain new opportunities. However, the daily expenditures, rent concerns, transportation, health insurance, and vulnerable job status characterized different disenfranchising factors. For them, the city neighborhoods were overwhelming because they were financially demanding and socially dissimilating. Furthermore, the work conditions were disappointing because there were no instances of social improvement or the ability to make a living. Third, informal work networks and unresolved job establishment. Unstable jobs shaped the experiences of many migrants from Matat. Many of them had to go through the experience to begin their search for positions that would pay more and guarantee better living and working conditions. Upon being convinced, many of these have to keep migrating from Casablanca, Agadir, even to the very, very south part of the country, which is Dakhla. Fourth, family structure. As noticed by the participant, migration is a necessity. As Ahmed states, one of the migrants, when you are out, you send the family money out of responsibility and maturity towards the household. But when they die, we immediately get married and settle to preserve the continuance of the household. The household, therefore, is coded as a mutual system of constant assistance, as what Schilling's 1981 advocated. Such obligation makes the job of male central in supporting the household, not only economically, but also by retaining its cultural and linguistic legacy. Ahmed said, we work and whatever we earn, we send to our children. And whenever Eid comes, we visit our families, bring our prophets, and support them. We kept in touch with our family members in this way. We work for 6, 7, or 10 months, a year. And we come to stay for 1 week or maximum 10 days with our families, and then we go back to work. 5, risk and return. Multiple qualities of modern states' artificial development concealed mismanagement of migrants' concerns of seeking better working conditions in urban centers. The 2 cases that fall in this category illustrate the void of the Moroccan modern state offered in mountainous citizen migrants. The first case is Abdul Jalil, who pronounced, you get a new contract to sign every 6 months, which was a similar job reality status in Casablanca. So Abdul Jalil, after all, he ended up deciding to return to Matat to at least stay close to his parents, even though he could not help them as before. The second case is Ibrahim, who came back to his village during Ramadan. He decided to stay until the end of the walnut harvest season. The day before, he was driving his family, and then an accident happened. So these cases illustrate that the whole situation or condition for these migrants is shaped by insecurity. So as a conclusion, socio-cultural tendencies forced the migrants to accept low wages in the urban, economically demanding cities, and they have received irregular salaries, and thus create hardship in their homes and hardship in their own conditions. The reason for their migration in the first place was mostly because of to support that lit of the fire in their household, meaning just to support their families. The migration of head of household left their families without a leader in local, which means that although that they left, and that gave the sense that there is no leader in the household. But for them, as long as they are sending these remittances, they keep that status of leading the household. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Echkaou. Our next speaker is Dr. Hannah Ridge, postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago, Center for Human Rights. Her work examines when citizens want democracy for their country and when they are satisfied with the democracy that they have. Additional research features religion and secularism in politics and construct validity. Dr. Ridge earned a PhD in political science at Duke University, and the title of her paper is Wasta and Democratic Attitudes in the Middle East.
So thank you all for being here, and thank you for the conference and supporting us. So corruption is pervasive in the Middle East, as I'm sure you're all aware, and that includes, by some standards, an idea that we call Wasta, which is a form of clientelistic exchange. And this is juxtaposed with corruption, otherwise known as fasad, which maps onto other systems by which we might otherwise measure corruption. But because of the fact that Wasta is in this in-between space between corruption and under the guise of clientelism, and what we might otherwise in the West call citizen services, which is to say getting things from your government that you're actually entitled to get by relationship to service members in your government who are supposed to give it to you. But at the same time, Wasta has been linked to several negative outcomes in the Middle East, such as inequality and underdevelopment, but it's also been linked to positive outcomes, for instance, arguing that it's compensating for existing but dysfunctional systems, as well as building trust within the social networks within which Wasta is being performed. And we can see when we, using data from the Arab Barometer, which is going to provide a lot of the data from my analyses, that citizens are reasonably willing to report that in the last 5 years, this is from the first wave of the Arab Barometer, that they themselves had made use or recourse to Wasta in order to get something solved for themselves, their family, or their community. At the same time, they're very cognizant of the fact that Wasta is at work in their society, and that's not always something that they're pleased about. So this is from the 2018 Arab Barometer on the other side that says, how much are people able to get jobs without Wasta if they're just doing it by merit? And to what extent is the use of Wasta overriding merit in employment? And in many countries, citizens are saying that it is happening always, and everywhere it's happening at least some of the time. We do get about 6% of the sample who say, no one's ever using Wasta to get a job. But the mere fact that a bunch of people are telling you that it's happening is indicating that those people might live in a very meritocratic neighborhood or are very naive, but that Wasta is actually operating pretty frequently in this domain. So what does this prevalence of potential corruption indicate to us? Well, we can even ask if it's viewed as corruption, given how prevalent it is and its potential link to citizen services and politics. And we know that if we ask citizens, again from the most 2018 Arab Barometer, and they see this Wasta being used, for instance, a government agent gets his brother a job. Is that form of Wasta, and they specifically use the Wasta, corruption, fasad? And 83% of the people in this sample said, yes, that's corrupt of him to have done that. And we can compare that to attitudes towards just taking a bribe, something that's very overtly recognized in basically every country as a corrupt practice. And still more people, almost 88%, said that taking a bribe or paying a bribe to facilitate a government service would be corrupt. And in fact, these are actually not the same people who are saying that both of these things are corrupt. They're correlated significantly, but it's only about 0.3, so it's not a very strong correlation either. So given that some people think that this amount of nepotistic Wasta is corruption, how does this relate to our idea of democratic attitudes in the Middle East? As has been noted, this is a very non-democratic region, but it doesn't necessarily mean people don't think that they're living in a democratic society. Corruption affronts most of our ideas of democratic norms. On one hand, it is against the idea of egalitarianism and participation. You shouldn't be able to get extra things or different things to which you're not entitled just because you have access to resources, be they money or access to people. And in particular, when we look at how we understand public attitudes towards democracy in the Middle East, we know that we're actually asking citizens about their attitudes towards demokratiya, the Arabic word that we put into these surveys where we ask them about democracy. And corruption plays a very important role in shaping citizens' understanding of what something is to be demokratiya. So you can see here, again, data from the Arab Barometer, where they ask what is the most important feature a state can have to be demokratiya. Some of these are the political elements we associate with democracy, and some of these are socioeconomic outcomes. But if we ask the first most important characteristic, or again, the second most important characteristic, for most people, the lack of financial and administrative corruption is going to be a key marker for demokratiya in their society. So we know that corruption is not the same thing as demokratiya, and in fact, they're probably antithetical to each other. So from this, I draw several predictions about the attitudes we're going to see people express about their society and their government, and particularly the attitudes they're going to express about democracy or demokratiya based on how they experience the use of Wasta in their society. One is that citizens are going to see their society as more corrupt if they're seeing more people using Wasta to get things done. And that when they see their society as more corrupt because of Wasta, they're also going to see the government as less capable of resolving corruption because Wasta is abounding. I also posit that they will be less likely to see their country as itself a democracy or demokratiya even though several of these countries are not democratic, and they weren't for most of the time periods in the 5 waves of the Arab barometer that I'm using, some citizens do say that their country is demokratia, in fact, demokratia to the highest degree possible. I also posit that people will have, those who do view their countries as democracies, will have a lower opinion of how the government is operating if they see Wasta in use, whereas that people who are living in non-democratic contexts in their own evaluation will think highly of the government if they see Wasta in usage, because it's a way of getting something done even in an ineffectual system. Another way to look at this then is to say, how does this look at their desire for democracy, not just the level of democracy that they currently have? And those who see Wasta in use should be more likely to want a democracy because you want to level the playing field. That said, if you're someone who admits to having used Wasta yourself, then maybe you don't want to level the playing field because you're going to lose access to this benefit that you have. Within a democracy, people who then see this form of corruption operating should be less likely to think that democracy is good for their country because it hasn't rooted out this corruption. Whereas if you're in a non-democracy, either you could say that democracy is less appropriate because of Wasta, or you could see that democracy might even be more appropriate because you want it to weed out the current corruption in your system. And so to evaluate all of these hypotheses, I turn to the first 5 waves of the Arab barometer, which asks about the frequency with which employment is attained by Wasta in that country. And I also use in the first wave of the Arab barometer a question about whether or not a person had made recourse to Wasta personally in the last 3 years, which we already saw. Citizens also indicated the extent to which they thought there was corruption in their country and the extent to which they thought the government was cracking down on corruption, and how democratic they thought their country was. They could also indicate whether or not they thought democracy was going to be the best system of government and whether or not democracy was appropriate for that country. So we can subset these citizens by their understanding of democracy, whether they think of it primarily in political terms or primarily in economic terms. But for the purposes of this and being okay on time, I'm just going to focus on the pooled sample results and treat them all together as attitudes towards democracy. I also include in the models a large number of covariates. We can talk in the Q&A about the choice of covariates here, but focusing primarily on citizens' attitudes towards the economy overall, whether or not the country is operating free or fair elections, whether or not people have access to public services, and whether or not they trust their political institutions, whether or not they trust other people, sex, age, tertiary education, religiosity, and membership in civil society organizations. And I will spare you the giant wall of regressions and just tell you the results, which is to say that people who do see Wasta in operation in their society are more likely to say that their country is corrupt. People who are themselves using Wasta are not more likely to say that their society is corrupt just because they're using it. And that people who see the Wasta operating in their society are less likely to believe that the government is capable of addressing corruption. We also see that people who view Wasta as widespread in their society view their society as less democratic. And when they view their society as democratic, but they're also observing Wasta, they do see the government as being less effectual. I do not, however, find support for the idea that in a non-democratic society that they would be more appreciative of the government if they see Wasta in operation. So it seems to be something that's hurting the democracies, but not necessarily helping the non-democracies in terms of the citizens' view of their efficacy and performance. When we turn to attitudes towards Wasta and democracy, we see that citizens who see Wasta as more prevalent are more likely to say that they want their countries to adopt democracy, whereas Wasta users themselves are more likely to oppose democracy because it is not in their interest either to view democracy as appropriate for their country, but they do say that it is the best form of government. So they're able to acknowledge an idea that democracy is a good idea, but they don't think it's appropriate for their country, either because it would mean for them giving up access to this clientelistic benefit, or because they think a society that is relying on these clientelistic benefits is not prepared for a system that would just abolish those things. So they're making a rather nuanced distinction here between self-usage and popular usage. I do not find that citizens who view their countries as democracies are different in terms of viewing it appropriate based on the level of Wasta, democracy, and though we do see citizens who are using Wasta are less likely to think that democracy is good for their country. So again, we're seeing this idea that if you think you're living in a democracy and there's still corruption, then somehow democracy is what's failing you. On the other hand, citizens who view their countries as non-democracies, if they see Wasta operating freely, then they're more likely to say that democracy should be adopted. So we're seeing an inverse relationship between democratization, Wasta, and support for democracy in these countries. So where do we sort of go from here? One, we're able to perceive from this that Wasta is pretty common, but it is not actually popular despite the widespread usage. It is seen as corrupt and as anti-democratic. This doesn't necessarily stop people from using it, particularly if they're using what might be considered good Wasta, which is using your relationships to get you something to which you were entitled, as opposed to bad Wasta, which is where you're using your relationships to get something that would be more unfair or to which you don't have a legal right. On the other hand, so the level of democracy that citizens perceive in their country is having a strong impact in how they're evaluating their co-nationals' usage of Wasta, and it's having an influence on how Wasta impacts their support for democratization in the country. And that self-interest is the real winner here. People who are using Wasta are less likely to think that it is bad, and they are far less likely to support a system that would involve taking away their access to this benefit. But we still need to do a lot more work on this. I am using, of course, the Arab barometer data, which is great in a lot of ways, but it's very quantitative, and it does not have access to a lot of what you normally think of in terms of follow-up questions. And so there's very limited, for instance, self-usage data. The self-usage data is only from the first wave of the Arab barometer. And it doesn't ask as many questions as we might like to really tap into what fasad means if Wasta is only sometimes fasad, and there's other things that always are. And to look at what else Wasta is really influencing. In particular, I'd like to have more questions also on different types of Wasta, not just using, for instance, nepotism or Wasta in employment, but looking also more particularly at Wasta that's tapping into actions by the government to see how people feel, if they feel differently about a private employer using Wasta to make hiring decisions than you feel about a government agency using Wasta to make hiring decisions as opposed to a meritocratic system. And we need to do more work to understand how self-interest is ultimately engaging with the generalized democratic commitment, because we always think that potential self-interest is the thing that might poison democratization in any regime. And so to look at really the role that self-interest is playing in forming these democratic attitudes and this particular form that is widespread of corruption in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're moving right along on schedule. Our final speaker is Mr. Salih Yasun, who is a PhD candidate at the Indiana University in Bloomington and a teaching fellow at Indiana University Northwest. He focuses on issues related to democratization and backsliding in the MENA region. His articles have appeared in a number of professional journals, and his title of his presentation is Explaining Party System Weakness in Post-Revolutionary Tunisia. A nice compliment, I think, to the first paper about party affiliation in Algeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon. The title of my work is Explaining Party System Weakness in Post-Revolutionary Tunisia. This is a study that I co-author with Bedirhan Mutlu. He's not here today. So, parties constitute a central pillar of democratic governance. They can aggregate and represent interests, make government accountable and legitimate. However, political parties and party system in general tend to remain weak in new democracies. So why is that? Why parties remain weak in new democracies? So this is a puzzle that we address in this study through using the case study of Tunisia. We particularly conduct interviews with political elite. These are semi-structured interviews between April and July 2022. So almost a year after President Kais Saied's constitutional coup. And we employ the analytical lens of historical institutionalism in our paper, which I will explain very soon. But first, some visual illustration. This is the last paper of day one, so you might be a bit tired. But this visual representation might help conceptualize things a little bit. So first image is Hezb el-Desturi el-Demokrati, the headquarters of the single party, RCD. It's currently not being used, but you see that it's a very sophisticated, expensive building, right? Underneath it, you see the headquarters of Ennahda, which is currently the largest party in Tunisia. Still a decent building, right? Decent for a political party, functioning. On the right side, you see El Tayyar el-Demokrati, I think the third or fourth largest party in Tunisia. It's basically, they rented an apartment space, an apartment floor, right? Not the type of building, not the type of space that you would expect from the third or fourth largest party of a democratic country. You would expect something bigger, more spacious. And an additional anecdote, we visited the headquarters of Tahya Tunis party, which is the fourth largest party in Tunisia. We found it deserted, you know, and we talked to the doorman. We said, you know, we are searching for the headquarters of Tahya Tunis. And he looked at us and said, oh, Allah yarhamu, you know, God bless their soul. They left the party and went to France. Okay, so this type of this suggests the phenomenon of party weakness in Tunisia in a post-revolutionary environment. So we engage in this study. We engage with the theory of historical institutionalism. Particularly, we build upon the assumption that political events occur within an interdependent historical context. Yet, there are also critical junctures. History presents critical junctures. So institutional change occurs through an asynchronous chain of episodes. So these critical junctures, events decisions taken during these moments can have long-lasting consequences. So we analyze episodes, we analyze historical development of party system in Tunisia in tandem with these critical junctures and how decisions taken within these junctures structure the relations afterwards. So particularly we will treat 2011 revolution in Tunisia and the decisions taken to structure the party system following the revolution as a critical juncture event. Particularly Hicken and Kuhonte emphasize that strong levels of party institutionalization under the authoritarian rule leads to strong levels of institutionalization under democratic settings. So strong institutionalism under authoritarian rule, strong institutionalization under transitioning settings. We depart from this conclusion in our study. We emphasize that highly institutionalized, highly powerful single party rule under authoritarian regime can actually mask vulnerability of governing parties and other democratic practices. Also, single party might compete with non-party actors under authoritarian rule, such as trade unions, civil society groups. So it might be single party related to party competition, but there could be other relevant players that really weaken parties' hold on power. Furthermore, authoritarian rule, single party rule under authoritarian era can lead to enduring negative perceptions for opposition, thus challenge to expand their base and cooperate. So, four factors, four conditions to stable party systems. First, stable rules and competition, stable social roots for the parties, perceptions of legitimacy for parties, and enduring strong party organization as identified by Mainwaring. We identify that in Tunisia, party system is weak. First, political system and party laws experienced big changes. Second, already low and even declining levels of electoral turnout with 42% in 2019. Third, what Tunisians call as party nomadism, MPs getting elected from one party, then switching their party to another one is a common phenomenon. And finally, we have declining levels of support for almost all parties. So you see in this table here, party seats earned from 2011 till 2019. Almost all parties, experienced some sort of decline. Some of them, such as Nida Tunis that you see on the middle, it appeared, made big success, then vanished from the scene. So again, this phenomenon suggests us that party system is not institutionalized in Tunisia. So why? We did interviews with 12 political elites from different ideological currents, such as liberals from AFEC, Islamists, and social democrats, leftists, and finally Bourguibists, which is an authoritarian successor movement that I will touch upon soon. So we covered all main ideological currents in our interviews in Tunisia. Here is a photo of Mr. Gilassi, who was former vice president of Harakat al-Nahda, and my co-author, and myself. So we tried to reach to executives from as much diverse currents as possible, conducted semi-structured interviews for about 2 hours, often in Tunisian or modern standard Arabic, sometimes in French or English. So what do our interviews tell us is that the history still continues to carry substantive weight. Single party rule relied on a clientele resource distribution structure where public often needed to become a member of the single party to gain benefits, or what might be termed as Wasta or Echkaou in Tunisian context was substantively tied to membership to single party rule, as Hannah's presentation enlightened us about. So, and in addition to this, institutions were segmented. Again, we talk about single party rule, we assume that single party controls everything. But this was not the case in Tunisia. First, you had a powerful union, the UGTT. Second, civil society associations still maintained a certain degree of independence. Security institutions, again, police force, single party was not able to completely override over these institutions. And as bureaucracy also remained very powerful, so these continue to weigh in within the democratizing process. So failure to monopolize, state was not able to, single party was not able to completely monopolize these institutions. So these are going to continue to have, this segmented nature of institutions are going to have, continue to have substantive effect. Opposition parties were weak, suppressed. Some of them were clientele looking for getting benefits, support from the single party rule. Others, such as Islamist and Nahda, was persecuted by the regime, so mostly underground. 2011 revolution presented a critical juncture and what we might consider as an opportunity to restructure the country's institutions. Elite at that time, political elite at that time, adopted an electoral system, which is hair quota system, which rewarded small parties substantively. Basically, if you get 2%, 1% of vote in the country, you are almost guaranteed to have a seat in the parliament, which meant that the parliament, the small players came to have overarching role. They became veto players, which fractured coalition governments and lowered support for governing parties. But not only that, it made it easier to defect from parties, right? If you can get 1%, 2%, why not come together with your friends, dissenting friends, and defect from the party? A weak financial law, so the financial law was weak, meaning that parties did not receive substantive financial support from the state. As a result, some of them needed to rely on powerful businessmen to support their campaign, which meant that they could not really build a platform for working class, for instance. They couldn't become programmatic parties because they needed the support of businessmen. And they came to be perceived as corrupt as a result. Or some parties which accepted that, you know, we're not going to take money from anyone, accepted this as a principle, ended up not having any presence, almost not having any presence besides the capital regions. So not being able to reach to rural areas, not being able to reach to non-coastal areas of the country. Finally, semi-presidential system. The choice of semi-presidential system came to haunt Tunisia because once someone becomes president, he or she has to leave the party. But what happens when someone leaves the party? Conflict erupts, right? For the leadership position, who comes next? And these are not really programmatic parties. These parties are either clientelistic or charismatic parties. They rely on the charisma of their leadership. So once the leader leaves the party, party dissolves, which was the case for Nida Tunis or CPR. So post-revolutionary parties, in addition to those factors, most lacked clear programs. System was an uneven system dominated by Ennahda. They could not become programmatic. And we also noted that parties formed prior to the revolution often could not establish coalition or work together with parties formed after the revolution. So this was very interesting for us because they appear to have different characteristics that made working hard. Citizens lacked awareness on institutions, the purpose of parliament or constitutional assembly in that process. They endured clientele expectations with MPs, so they expected MPs to deliver them clientele, goods and benefits, yet MPs did not have the ability, did not have the means to respond to these clientele expectations. And the links, the relations between elected officials and the masses remained weak. As you can see here, percentage of Tunisians with political party membership did not really exceed 2%, which is, I think, a low score for new democracies. UGTT and the historical legacy, an important point. So UGTT, a very powerful union dating back to Tunisia's independence struggle, even prior to that. It was instrumental in catalyzing the 2011 revolution. Between 2011 and 2014, UGTT acted as a veto player engaged in strikes. And these strikes were quite detrimental to Troika government at that time. It's accused of opposing structural reforms. Perhaps that could have helped parties to mobilize their base, expand their popularity. Instead, UGTT advocated the interest of workers in the public sector. In addition to that, so UGTT, again, going back to the segmented nature of institutions coming to haunt Tunisia, it's a blessing and a curse. Blessing because it helped ensure revolution, a curse because democracy is not the only game in town, right? And another outcome is that leftist parties are unable to benefit from its base. In Europe, for instance, usually in Western Europe, leftist parties, social democrat parties have links to unions. This is not the case in Tunisia because this is an independent union that really does not allow parties to penetrate to its base, and its membership does not have, to quote Marx, class consciousness. This is what some of our interviewees told us, basically. So, as a result, parties come, parties go. Nida Tunis, an authoritarian successor party built around the charismatic image of its leader, you know, not having a strong ideology, Bourguibism, not becoming a strong melting pot, and party melting away. So, historical institution, we employed a historical institutions framework in our study. We look at episodes followed by critical junctures, and we identify that factors that come from authoritarian era, and even prior to that, continue to haunt Tunisia. Powerful union, add to that a strong bureaucracy, sometimes referred as the largest party in Tunisia, Tunisian bureaucracy. And these decisions taken within critical juncture of revolutionary period, post-revolutionary period, did not help the process. It, in fact, potentially made parties a lot weaker for the sake of reaching consensus. So for the future, we would like to perhaps benefit from discussion here. We improve connection between our theory and our case. We would like to make our narrative smoother, and perhaps we are interested in integrating more quantitative evidence on mass attitudes. Thank you very much.